One of my guests is Janelle Wong. Hi, Janelle. Welcome. And Janelle is a professor in American Studies and Asian American Studies in the University of Maryland. She received her PhD of political science from Yale and has written many papers and books on race and politics, immigration, and political behaviors. Janelle, when I saw the long list of your publications, I was so blown away. Thank you for coming to the discussion.
I'm so happy to be here.
My other guest today is Vincent Pan. Hi, Vincent. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you.
Vincent is the co-executive director of an advocacy organization called Chinese for Affirmative Action. Vincent, judging from your organization's name, I guess where you stand on affirmative action is totally ambiguous. But kidding aside, I want to thank you and your organization for fighting for Chinese Americans in the past 46 years. Many of our audience know very well the names such as Vincent Chen, Wen Ho Lee, both of whom were the victim of unjust treatment towards Chinese Americans. It was you guys who picked up the fight on justice for them. So I thank you, and thank you for coming to our panel discussion. And to our audience, thank you for spending part of Friday evening with us. I hope this discussion is a crash course to answer all the questions you have around affirmative action. This discussion is live on YouTube. You are very welcome to ask questions anytime in live chat. We will try our best to answer your questions. So first off, let me give you guys a roadmap of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about briefly about the history and context of how affirmative action was established in the US, what affirmative action is within the parameter of law. We're also going to talk about whether affirmative action hurts or benefits Asian Americans. And of course, we're going to address some concerns you guys have around affirmative action. So without further ado, let me turn to my guests to give us a little bit of history and context on how affirmative action came into existence in the US. Janelle, would you like to take the lead on answering that question?
Sure, thank you so much. So many of you are familiar with the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which requires equal protection. And it's really because people must be treated equally under the law that Constitution came into existence. However, for most of US history, 100 years, this amendment, this important protection was not enforced. And so affirmative action is really came about because US lawmakers recognize that discrimination cannot be addressed simply through prohibiting discrimination. Instead, we must affirmatively protect people's rights, and that is what affirmative action does. So President Kennedy was the first to use this term in a very general way, and even Republicans like Richard Nixon recognize that we need affirmative action to protect rights, because without it, as we know, historically for 100 years, those rights were not protected.
And so, Janelle, what does affirmative action try to accomplish in the current, today's context? It is for whom? And is affirmative action imposed on public institutions only? Are private institutions not affected by affirmative action?
So I'm going to turn this one to Vin, because this is one of the things that he has been focusing on.
Yeah, sure. Vin, jump in, please.
Sure. And if I just go back, I think, some of the history that Janelle shared is so important and probably warrants even more context. So basically, like the long history of race and gender in the United States is a story where at the beginning, wealthy, white, powerful men who owned property had all of the rights. And even though the Constitution said it's for everybody, it was only belonged to a small group of people. So the entire history of how we've come to achieve more equal rights for everybody has been by taking proactive or affirmative steps or action to be able to create equal opportunity for everyone. And so, we need to understand that affirmative action policies today are part of that long history, and that Asian Americans and Chinese Americans are part of that long history too. And so you mentioned, yes, I work at Chinese for Affirmative Action, and it's a 50-year-old organization because for 50 years, it's always been the case that we advance our community's rights, our community's progress by linking up with others who have also been disadvantaged, and whether that's women, whether that's other Asian Americans, whether that's other communities of color, right? And it takes positive steps. It takes saying the status quo is not really fair, and that we have to make real the promise of the Constitution, which is supposed to provide equality for everyone. So where are we in terms of like affirmative action today? Well, affirmative action today, now we tend to think of it in a much more narrow way. And in the narrow way, it's like our ability to consider things like race, things like gender in order to fight discrimination. And it's for the most part prevalent in all of society. So the private sector in California has affirmative action. So if you want to see more movies like Crazy Rich Asians, you know, you want Hollywood to take affirmative action. If you want more CEOs or more people of color who in the corporate boardroom, right? You know, private sector largely prioritizes affirmative action as a way to be more inclusive and more diverse. It's only on the public sector side in some states where affirmative action is currently not allowed. And so in 42 of the states, affirmative action is legal in the public sector as well as the private sector. And California is one of only 8 or 9 states that does not allow it in the public sector. And that's what much of this debate is about, just the degree to which the public sector in California, which is employment, contracting for businesses, and education, to the degree to which they can, you know, take proactive steps to fight discrimination.
So Vincent, just as you said just now, originally the affirmative action is aimed to improve the opportunities in the public employment and public contracting, public education. But now the private sector also take up on that. So it has a very positive effect on the private sector too. And but today, as the society has progressed a lot, is affirmative action still very much necessary in today's society?
I think so. You know, and I'll give you a couple of examples that are happening now. You mentioned Vincent Chen, you mentioned Wen-Ho Lee. We have, you know, examples of the same stories happening right now. So with the COVID pandemic, we've seen a dramatic increase in the rise of anti-Asian hate incidents. And these are affecting not just Chinese Americans, but all Asian Americans. At CAA, we have a reporting center, and there's been over 1,000 of these incidents reported from every single state in the United States. And so it doesn't work to say, well, just crime is crime, it's all the same. No, these are specific crimes that are targeted against Asian Americans, and they require specific solutions that will help Asian Americans. And so that's an example of how, you know, seeing through the lens of race can get to the problems that we face, right? And so if we want to address those types of hate incidents, it's not the same. They're related to, but it's not the same as hate incidents that might be targeting other communities. And so they deserve to have specific responses. You know, you mentioned Wen-Ho Lee. You know, right now we're seeing many Chinese scholars, scientists, students be racially profiled simply for the association with China, simply for their ethnic background. And these also, you know, demand very specific solutions. And it requires, again, being very mature and grown up about the fact that race matters in these instances. And so that's like 2 very, very current examples. But again, you know, I think in all of society, we tend to support affirmative action when we want to see, you know, more Asian American executives, you know, partners in law firms, medical school deans, and not just doctors. There's a whole range of things that I think we take it for granted. And, you know, to get, I think, to your point of this conversation, it is controversial, but the ways it's controversial is very, very limited to how we think about select college admissions.
So now that you mentioned that, I'm wondering, especially for California trying to bring back affirmative action, if affirmative action has been working for a lot of the minorities, so who are the main opponents and who are the main supporters? I think we all know, probably most people are in support of that, but why do people oppose that in California?
If I could go, and then I would love to hear Professor Wong's view on this.
Sure.
This is a very partisan issue. So for the most part, like Democrats support affirmative action, and very conservative Republicans, led by Donald Trump, oppose it. And they oftentimes use the issue to scare people into thinking that, it's going to help someone else. It won't help you. It's going to help someone else. And it's a very divisive tactic, right? And I think what we have to do is actually look at the policy and understand how it works. And then we come to see that, all the small business associations support Prop 16, the Asian American Bar Association, the lawyers, they support Prop 16, the hospitals and the health industry, education, civil rights groups all support Prop 16. And the main opponents are folks who are just ideologically opposed. And they have like a very, very narrow way of thinking about the world.
The party lines, yeah.
It's very much party lines. But then I also will say, because, I'm Chinese, I'm Asian American, and I hear the concerns that so many of our community members have, and they fear that their kids won't get a good college education. And I just want to acknowledge that because that's very real. But the solution to that has very little to do with affirmative action.
Yeah, and with that said, I do have a question for Janelle. So I guess the biggest myth on affirmative action seems to be around racial quotas, especially in college admissions. And I know within Chinese communities, especially on social media, WeChat, for instance, one of the typical rhetoric is, since we have quotas in college admissions, why should we, should we have quotas in jail and in sports teams too? That's a very typical rhetoric on WeChat when they argue against affirmative action. So Janelle, I wonder, do colleges have racial quotas these days? Are there laws restricting race-based admissions?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kylie. And I will say that I'm also Chinese American, and I have a child who is a junior in high school. And so I've been following this debate really carefully. And there are not quotas in college admissions. I think this is one of the most dangerous myths that is affecting the understanding of affirmative action. In fact, there have not been quotas. Quotas have been disallowed by the Supreme Court since 1978. So how does affirmative action work today? Affirmative action allows the admissions committees to consider race, but it can only consider race in a very narrow way. So race can be considered as one factor in college admissions, but never the only factor and never the primary factor. And so that is why I think we see.
So it's only race conscious, it's not race-based admission, right?
The Supreme Court has not allowed for race to be the sole admission factor. And in fact, no college does that. And, I think it has, that myth of quotas has actually turned our attention from the benefits of affirmative action. So, you asked, why do we need affirmative action today when we've come so far? We know that women, for instance, are still making less on the dollar than men, and that includes Asian American women. We know that small businesses in the Asian and Chinese community are going to be especially hard hit by anti-Asian bias in the wake of COVID. And affirmative action allows for specific policies and tools to address that specific kind of racism that our community faces.
Sorry, there's another rhetoric, and I really want you guys to address that. And I'm very much interested in listening to what you guys have to say. There was a survey, they say, a few years ago, and more than 39% of admission officers from both private and public colleges admitted they held Asian American students to higher standards. So another typical rhetoric within Chinese American communities is that schools these days admit underqualified students of African Americans and Latinos, and thus will over time bring the school ratings down. They are worried that public universities such as the University of California will be rated much lower in the future. So I don't know, Janelle or Vincent, do you guys have any thoughts on whether these concerns are valid at all?
Well, I can speak to maybe this quickly. The first is that there is racism against Asian Americans. There's racism against Asian Americans in education, in employment, in business, in media. And that's why we do the work that we do to fight that racism. But we shouldn't be confused about what's causing the racism. What's causing the racism are systems that have always primarily benefited those who are wealthier and more powerful. And in the United States, the history of that is, white men, right? And so, I think we have to be very, very strong in rejecting stereotypes of other communities, stereotypes of against African Americans or Latinos and Latinos in the same way that we want to reject stereotypes against Asian Americans. So we have to fight, racism wherever we find it, and we know that it exists. But that's different from sort of shifting, our concerns to allowing other groups to be treated poorly too.
Janelle, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that affirmative action is one of the best tools for addressing racism. And there is also there's no evidence that a more diverse college class creates any kind of lower standards. So one of the things that I think is missed in this conversation is that Asian American students and all students benefit. They actually show empirically better learning outcomes in a more diverse college environment. And so I think, if you want your students to learn and have the best learning environment possible, then affirmative action is a tool to get there.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I do have another rhetoric. So, okay, before we go to that, I wonder, do you guys have any facts supporting the narrative that affirmative action hurts or benefits Asian Americans? Because I've heard both. And I know that, these days there's everyone has alternative facts, but I guess that when it comes to facts, there should be only one set of facts, right? So do you have any insights on that?
Well, I would say there are two different areas where we can look. One is that in places that have practiced affirmative action, we see Asian American admissions rising over time. In places like California, where affirmative action is banned, we see those numbers stagnating. At the same time, we just saw a really rigorous study that shows that Asian Americans did not benefit from the ban on affirmative action. This was based on thousands and thousands of students. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah.
Okay. As we speak, well, Vincent, I'll let you add on to that. But as we speak, there is a question coming in from someone named, let's see, Sarah Young. And she's asking, can you explain what the benefit Asians can get for college admissions from Prop 16? So I guess this is specifically California question. So I'll let Vincent answer that.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that can happen is that we would be able to recognize that the Asian American community and also Pacific Islander community is very, very diverse. So not all Asians are the same. And so when we can talk about our identity in a more realistic way, we can talk about, which part of the Chinese diaspora we are actually part of. And so, we would be able to say, don't just lump all folks from mainland China or Hong Kong or Singapore or Taiwan or Mongolia. You can't just lump everyone together, because when we apply, we actually bring different perspectives. And I think that part of being Asian American is to contribute those perspectives on how to make the world work better. And so I can't think of a stronger argument for the society that we are living in today, where we know that the relationship between the United States and China and Asia more broadly is becoming more important, that these are things that we can bring to the table. I think these are the things that make our candidacy stronger, right? It allows us to kind of get away from the stereotype of all Asian Americans are like this, this, and this, and instead sort of reveal the very different ways that we are very complicated, that we have nuanced stories, that each of us are individuals when we apply, but that our background is part of that, right? And so I think we would see much more equal opportunity to be seen as human beings and not just as test scores, for example. And I think that it also would allow targeted support programs. So not just for admissions, but also for helping students do well in college, to succeed in college. It would also affect the ability to make sure we have more Asian American faculty members. We have very, very few Asian American faculty members, almost, and even fewer Asian Americans in leadership and administrative positions in college. And affirmative action would help all of that. I think that would help decrease the amount of racism that we see in general in the higher education setting.
Let me just emphasize this point again that Vin made, because I think it is really important that the way that affirmative action is practiced today is through a holistic assessment of students. That means viewing students as whole people, not erasing our background, not erasing race, which is a part of who we are as Asian Americans. And so what Prop 16 and other affirmative action programs do is allow students to be seen as whole people, not reduce us to simply a test score. And I think that is critically important, that we be seen as every part of ourselves in this country.
And I'm going to add, I know that most Chinese Americans came from countries where the only criteria for getting admissions into college is meritocracy. The idea of testing and testing well is the only reason why we should be admitted. And this has formed a lot of people's view on college admission policies. So Janelle, since you work in the University of Maryland, and coming from the university side, can you talk a little bit more about, I guess one of the concerns from people who are opposing affirmative action is that they think when it comes to college admission that, they know that in this country, it is a holistic consideration of a person in whole, right? But are the schools, universities going to admit somebody, let's say somebody of African American background or Latino background with much lower testing scores? And does it mean that they are rejecting Chinese Americans who have much higher testing scores? And in that way, it is hurting the Chinese Americans as a whole when affirmative action is coming into play?
No, most places in this nation, as Vin mentioned, do practice affirmative action. They do allow for the consideration of race, including some of the top universities in this country. And Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in particular are thriving under those conditions. We see Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans actually doing very well under the current admission systems that include race. But I also think it's important to really look at the big picture here. Affirmative action is not only about college admissions. Affirmative action is also an important tool for addressing racial discrimination, the racial discrimination that Asian Americans face in all other kinds of places in American life, not just college admissions. And that is why a majority of Asian Americans for the last decade have actually supported affirmative action, because I think they know that racism is still a factor in their lives and that we benefit from programs that will recognize and address that discrimination when it comes to government programs for grants after like this kind of COVID economic downturn, or when it comes to gender discrimination. So if affirmative action is so harmful to us, why do most Asian Americans support it? Because it is one of the most important tools to address systemic discrimination against Asian Americans.
So coming back to this question, a lot of people also argue that if race is only like a one factor to consider, and actually why don't we get rid of race altogether? Because we're not trying to judge people by their color. Why don't we institute a economic-based affirmative action. I know that one of the rhetoric that people love to cite is Martin Luther King's quote. And so I quote, Martin Luther King says that I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So do you have any insights on answering that question?
You know, at Prop 16, we see this, and, you know, we work with the King family, including Dr. Bernice King, who's MLK's daughter, and she endorsed Prop 16 very early on and expressed, you know, I think her strong support for affirmative action. And here's why. You know, Dr. King did not stand for willful ignorance. He was fighting for racial justice. And I think we ought to remember that. And I think we in the Asian American community have to be careful, and we have to understand that the long history of struggle for Black Americans has been in support of affirmative action too. So, you know, I think that's one point. But I think more broadly, right, you know, the dream of the United States has always been equality, right, from the very beginning. But the practice of it has always been discrimination. It's always been prejudice. And so our job is to keep pushing forward to that ideal. And the way to do that is have laws that understand the reality that we're living in. Even just what you shared before about admissions officers admitting to having bias against Asian Americans. If we want to fix that, we have to be able to have race-conscious programs. So race-conscious programs include like better training for folks. You know, it includes making sure people are culturally competent. It means making sure that those admissions officers include Asian Americans, right? So there's just very, very few to zero examples where just putting our head in the sand and hoping that it'll all work out if we're just so-called colorblind, you know, exist, right? And I think the other part that gets missed is around the content of the character. And so I think as a community, we do want the content of our character to reach across with other communities and in our communities to make things more fair for everyone. And that includes women, that includes racial minorities, it includes all sorts of people who are being you know, left out. And I think that's like what we want to stand for as a community. And affirmative action is just one part of it for sure. And I think the issues around college admissions are real, but the solutions have, you know, include affirmative action, but they also include things like, you know, more UC campuses. They also include things like more ethnic studies. They also include things like improving the quality of all of our schools so it's not so competitive at just like 1 or 2. Right? So there's lots of things we can do as a very strong community to make those things happen. And I think like just battling over, you know, a Republican view of affirmative action is a mistake.
And Janelle, I'm going to go back to you and grill on you on this one. So people are saying that schools over time, their ratings will be downgraded if they admit people of lower testing scores. What do you say on that? Is that a valid concern from university's perspective?
You know, I think that we're seeing a sea change in the way that universities and the public views testing. And it's becoming very clear that 20 years of research in higher education is not wrong, that standardized tests are not great ways of indicating a student's potential. And so that's why we're seeing that many universities are starting to question standardized tests. I want to go back to something that Vin mentioned on, you know, the class and race kinds of disparities that we see in this country, and how we have to do everything we can to address both kinds of inequalities. We can both address racial inequality and class inequality. We do not have to choose one. We should actually do everything in our power to address both. That means addressing K through 12 quality for all students. That means for me that we should be pouring our energy as a community into political participation across a range of issues. So for Chinese, we can have a really, I think, important voice in expanding public education and funding for public education, and that we can do so in a way where we benefit and all people benefit. But narrowing our focus into this Republican-led fight against racial equality seems like a misuse of our very precious resource, our political voice.
Can I ask you guys a question? This question is from one of our friends on YouTube, and he's saying, I'm a Chinese grad of a UC, I guess is University of California. I struggled to find a job after college. My parents, who are working class, couldn't help me. Can Prop 16 help students graduating into a recession and find work?
Yes, I think that, the way the law actually works, and we didn't get too much into this, but wherever Chinese Americans or Asian Americans or any group, women, face discrimination, affirmative action can help, right? And, we at CAA hear many, many times about people facing discrimination in the workplace, both in terms of trying to get a job and then also in terms of trying to get promoted. Right. And so I think that, affirmative action basically says, well, let's make sure we're being inclusive, right? And let's make sure that, like that UC grad has an equal opportunity, and to make sure that, places of work don't have systems set up that either intentionally or unintentionally are discriminating or leaving our community members out.
I have another question from the person that previously asked another question, Sarah Young, and she was asking, you mentioned that over 40 states have AA already, meaning have affirmative action already. Do these states have higher percentages of Asians in management positions than California?
Yeah, well, as Sarah knows, that comparing states can be tricky because they're all different sizes and they all have different percentages of Asian Americans. But, when you look at the most sophisticated research, we do see, for example, Asian American businesses that seek government contracts. They do much, much better in cities and states that do have affirmative action. That's like one point of reference. I think in the private sector, as Janelle mentioned, a lot of the select universities, there are many Asian Americans attending those schools. So I think, generally speaking, yes, but we should also, just acknowledge that there is no magic bullet, right? This is one tool in the tool belt that we have to have in order to fight against structural racism, against gender discrimination. But in of itself, it cannot solve all the problems that we have, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least have that opportunity.
Janelle, if you want to add on to that, I'll allow you to. Otherwise, I have another question for you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so people who are opposing affirmative action claim that affirmative action is to ensure equal outcome instead of equal opportunity. What do you think?
That's absolutely not the case. We know, and this is something that we've emphasized again and again, that affirmative action there is a tool to try to improve access because of structural barriers to not only higher education, but also corporate America, government jobs, and other areas where actually Asian Americans have faced real discrimination. And so affirmative action, I can't emphasize enough, is not a quota system. And there is no metric by which it is designed to ensure equal outcomes. That is a mistake.
Yeah, thank you, Janelle. And since it seems like within Chinese American communities, when it comes to affirmative action, it is especially divided. And I'm wondering, as Asian American as a whole, actually, when we talk about Asian Americans, right, we are in fact referring to a very, very diverse group of people, not just Chinese Americans, but like Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Indians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Pakistani, Cambodian, Hmong people. So do we know the degree of support or disapproval of affirmative action within each ethnic groups? Are the Chinese Americans the only group that is so divided on this issue?
Yeah, so, I've been conducting Asian American public opinion over the last 20 years, and consistently we see that about 70% of Asian Americans support affirmative action. Among every Asian group, we see support for affirmative action. Am I cutting out?
Yeah, you're cutting out a little bit. Yeah, I don't know why. So could you just
okay,
say,
sorry about that.
Yeah, could you just say again?
Yeah, so within each Asian group, and we often survey groups across the Asian American diaspora, so all the groups that you mentioned, we see that support is higher than opposition, and even among Chinese, we see support is higher than opposition in many cases. So Chinese Americans do show a little bit lower level of support than other Asian American groups who are tremendously supportive. And that, I think, has to do with some of the miscommunication, misunderstanding about how affirmative action works. But even Chinese Americans are supportive.
Do you have any insights why it seems that within Chinese American communities, the opposition voice is louder, it seems, than other ethnic groups within Asian American communities? Like, why is that the case? Do you guys have any insights?
Well, all communities, we have passionate people. I consider myself very passionate in support of affirmative action and racial justice. And I think that, I'm not surprised that issues that are important to people are going to bring out very heated emotions. So I think that, maybe we can change the stereotype that all Asian Americans are shy and quiet through this, while also trying to, have, I think, a good conversation and discussion, because, there are many things that we probably agree on. I think in some cases there's just a strong either disagreement or just divide on what the basic facts are in terms of how to solve those problems.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered a lot on the topic of affirmative action. I wonder whether you guys have any final thoughts, and if you do, just share them with us now. And otherwise, I would give the concluding words. So do you have any?
Well, this is very timely. I want to thank you for having me on. I want to thank folks who listened and are keeping an open mind. Obviously, I help represent the Yes on Proposition 16 campaign. We're trying to reach every single voter. Asian Americans are not the largest group in the state, but every Asian American voter matters to me and matters to the campaign. We sued the Secretary of State to make sure they got the Chinese translation correct. So we really, believe that this will help our community members and also help all community members. And at the end of the day, we fight discrimination when we make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity, and that we know that equality can't just be for some. That's not equality. That equality has to be for everyone, and that includes our community too.
And I'll just say that there are some very high-profile Chinese Americans who have spoken directly to the ways in which affirmative action has helped them, like Helen Zia, who was featured in the documentary on Asian America. She spoke directly and poignantly about how affirmative action helped to move her forward in her career. So affirmative action does help Asian Americans, and I hope that we can come together around this important issue.
Yeah, I want to thank my two guests today, Janelle Wong and Vincent Pan, for your wonderful insights. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in on Friday night on this very important issue. I know this is an ongoing issue that we might have multiple sessions to discuss this. And I want to also leave our audience with one of the quotes that I recently found, and I very much relate to it. it says, hey, we're all humans until race disconnected us, religion separated us, wealth classified us, and politics divided us. So like you guys mentioned earlier in this program, that affirmative action seems to be an issue that is that has been dividing us by politics. So I hope that our audience watching this video will draw some conclusion on their own and will take in some facts and not let politics divide us on this issue. So I hope you guys all like this video, and please give it a like, share with your friends, and subscribe. 谢谢大家，这里是言行天下，我是那人琴，and thank you very much, Janelle and Vincent. Thank you.